Hey everybody, I arbitrarily cut the piece by Nachtmann, Identity Politics, or How to Love the Prison and Cage Oneself, in two, because it was getting a little long. And I want to, keep these videos, not too long. Um, so this is part two. Anyway, the section I'm starting from is titled Gossip. It is not that the denial of its essential driving force is not a characteristic of bourgeois society in general. By virtue of the appearance it objectively produces, it legitimizes itself precisely not in terms of content as a specific form of domination, but as non-domination, economically as a society of the free and equal, politically as a state of the people, which, quote, we all, end quote, are. However, while ideology in its illusory form generally still allows something of the malaise of capitalist socialization to shine through by at least naming what it rationalizes, German ideology has completely emancipated itself from its social basis. It no longer even produces a false concept of reality, but only a relentless and merciless delusion. Such delusional denial of reality, quote, the disavowal of wealth striving for itself, end quote, is thereby transformed into proof of moral superiority, in the proof that the Germans are not a nation of unscrupulous profiteers, but that they are characterized by depth of mind and a generous spirit. Thus, by simply denying that everything in capitalism revolves around exchange value, that everyone chases after money as the incarnation of general wealth, by affirming capitalism as a, quote, system of the forces of production, end quote, and at the same time declaring everything that inevitably characterizes to be external to it, and basically foreign to its nature, this theory already contains in nous the modern mass delusion, the ethnic anti-Semitism with which National Socialism then succeeded. List thus splits off the necessary consequences of capitalist socialization from this socialization itself and projects them into the outside world as evil intent. 50 years before Freud and 100 years before the dialectic of enlightenment, Marx already succeeded in developing the basic features of pathic projection on the basis of Friedrich List's national economy, which still determines social life in Germany today. Quote, since his own work, theory, conceals a secret aim, List suspects secret aims everywhere. Being a true German Philistine, Herr List, instead of studying real history, looks for the secret, bad aims of individuals, and owing to his cunning, he is very well able to discover them, puzzle them out, List makes great discoveries, such as that Adam Smith wanted to deceive the world by his theory, and that the whole world let itself be deceived by Adam Smith, until the great Herr List woke it from its dream, ... But just as the German bourgeois knows no better way of opposing his enemy than by casting a moral slur on him, casting aspersions on his frame of mind, and seeking bad motives for his actions, in short, by bringing him into bad repute and making him personally an object of suspicion, so Herr List also casts aspersions on the English and French economists, and retails gossip about them. And just as the German Philistine does not disdain the pettiest profit-making and swindling in trade, so Herr List does not disdain to juggle with words from the quotations he gives in order to make them profitable. Herr List does not disdain to stick the trademark of his rival onto his own bad products, in order to bring his rival's products into disrepute by falsifying his rival's products, or even to invent downright lies about his competitor in order to discredit him, end quote. Marx. Quote, what the German ascribes to others is what the German actually intends to do himself. To insinuate that the established capitalist powers, in contrast to the Germans, are only concerned with bargaining and gathering, therefore means that the Germans would prefer to snatch everything for themselves. Quote, it proves to us that his idealism in practice is nothing but the unscrupulous, unthinking disguise of a repulsive materialism. End quote. End quote, Marx. In general, Marx considers the view that a society as a nation must, by temporarily isolating itself from the world market, catch up with a development that other nations have already undergone, as reactionary as resentment-laden envy, and therefore showers it with the ridicule that it objectively deserves. Quote, to hold that every nation goes through this development internally would be as absurd as the idea that every nation is bound to go through the political development of France or the philosophical development of Germany. What the nations have done as nations, they have done for human society. Their whole value consists only in the fact that each single nation has accomplished for the benefit of other nations one of the main historical aspects, one of the main determinations, in the framework of which mankind has accomplished its development, and therefore after industry in England, politics in France, and philosophy in Germany have been developed, they have been developed for the world, and their world historic significance, as also that of these nations, has thereby come to an end. This assessment of industry is then at the same time the recognition that the hour has come for it to be done away with, or for the abolition of the material and social conditions in which mankind has had to develop its abilities as a slave, ... But the wretched individual who ... remains within the present system, who desires only to raise it to a level which has not yet reached in his own country, and who looks with greedy envy on another nation that has reached this level, has this wretched individual the right to see in industry anything else but huckstering interest? Has he the right to say that he is concerned only for the development of man's abilities and man's mastery of the forces of nature? End quote. Marx. Because Marx does not propagate a, quote, catching up, end quote, of industrial development in the existing state, Marx does not have a, quote, theory of the nation, end quote, but only the categorical imperative of the nation's abolition, because only the nation's abolition would enable the full development of the productive forces and thus the undiminished satisfaction of the needs of all people. New section. A program calling for action. Based on this passage, one can see the stupidity of the repeatedly voiced accusation that Marx would represent a theory according to which all countries would have to go through the same development of capitalization as the Central European countries. It is not Marx but Liszt with whom the idea of catching up development originates, and this is why Liszt basically possesses the ingredients that constitute a proper German anti-imperialism, the rhetoric of the persecuted victim, which portrays Germany as enslaved, bartered away, and exploited by foreign powers, and in this way, with the accusatory invocation of, quote, national impotence, end quote, national slavery, and, quote, national death, end quote. Liszt, cited in Marx, already expresses what the Nazis summarized in the catchword of the, quote, proletarian nations, end quote. Then the form of thought implied therein, which cannot imagine rule in any other way than as an external command over a structure which is in itself autarkic, as usurpation, as foreign rule, based on anonymous, secret conspiracy, and which is in turn tangible only in its exponents. Furthermore, the idealization and naturalization of the, quote, German people, which had to break away from, quote, foreign domination, end quote, in order to develop its, quote, productive forces, end quote, for itself, and thus a socialization that was oriented not towards self-interest, but toward the common good, later propagated by the Nazis under the slogan, quote, Third Way. Finally, the here included resentment against the world market and cosmopolitanism. However, the politicizing delusion of persecution, as it is expressed by Liszt, is neither specifically German nor particularly dangerous. The rhetoric of persecuted innocence, the affirmation of the nation as a productive body, the projection of all evil onto, and personalization and foreign domination, all stem from the arsenal of the French Revolution. During the French Revolution, this bourgeois polemic had the purpose of establishing a liberal social order that propagated happiness for all and, in its bourgeois revolutionary exuberance, defined the nation not as a territorial unit, but as the boundless entity of cosmopolitanism. In this case, on the other hand, it serves to inaugurate a society that positions itself as an explicit front against the liberal political economy and the states that represent it. It is here where the self-destruction of the Enlightenment and of liberalism, as whose avant-garde Germany functions, is announced. With this, the delusion of victimization and paranoia becomes more than just an annoying but harmless quirk that can be found everywhere. It becomes a program calling for action, the content of which is to realize again the inverted expression of reality itself. To a certain reality, the abstractions of peace, freedom from crisis, community, in which the capitalized world presents itself in an inverted way, and as is well known, abstractions destroy reality. When Marx says about Liszt that, quote, when Marx says about Liszt that it, quote, is just this empty idealistic phraseology that enables Liszt to ignore the real barriers standing in the way of Liszt's pious wishes and to indulge in the most absurd fantasies, end quote. Marx. Then he may have been carried by the hope that this silliness would be exposed as embarrassing by reality and would thus finish itself off. Famously, however, things turned out quite differently, because it was institutionally nourished and favored, namely by the unholy alliance of the state and the workers' movement, which aimed to render the paradox of utilitarian accumulation of capital social reality. The fantasy of omnipotence born out of impotence was able to shape the world in its own image. The German victim mania was given the opportunity not only to misjudge the, quote, real barriers that stood in the way of its wishes, but to overcome those wishes and finally to put its pious, silly fantasy of crisis-free capital accumulation into practice through the planned murder of 6 million people. New section, violent self-disciplining. Germany has thus shown the world in an exemplary way that it can be worthwhile to position oneself against the established nations, while at the stage of an underdeveloped country, that it is possible to catch up with a capitalist development by selling one's social backwardness without further ado as an avant-garde position, and installing an anti-bourgeois capital relation, which is based on the combination of resentment and legality, of popular mobilization in the state, and which in this way makes skipping liberalism possible. That the German model of capitalization recommends itself for imitation by all those similarly dispositioned, that its representatives are on the lookout for suitable alliances, and that in turn the German model is attractive to all those who, as people, feel that they have been deprived, oppressed by, quote, imperialism, or shortchanged, and are determined to settle accounts, goes almost without saying. It is the objectivity of ideology as a form of thought, pushing toward practice, that finally makes alliances possible, but first of all creates the factual affinity when there can be no talk of a closing of ranks. It is even more remarkable that Max Horkheimer noted the following about the interrelationship between the German awakening and the National Revolutionary, quote, springtime, between the, quote, Third Reich and the, quote, Third World, as early as 1959, when the whole world, and the left in particular, considered, quote, national liberation to be a progressive cause. Quote, the transforming and preserving form of thought is similar to the transforming power of thought itself. In order to progress to more appropriate forms, society must repeatedly induce society's individuals to adopt new modes of behavior. One thinks of the habituation to factory work in the course of the Industrial Revolution. The outmoded way of life, which in its lesser taughtness once appeared in retrospect as a lost homeland, was replaced in an outmoded form of existence by new ways of being. The emancipatory process through which history practically criticized pre-industrial forms of society in today's developed countries took place here with some slowness, corresponding to the little developed technology inhibited and encouraged by internal and external crises. Today, in the former colonial countries, the transition is being made up for rapidly, ruthlessly radical. There, the natives under their dictators today expect no less of themselves than what had already been expected of them by the imperialists of the 19th century. Slowness and a lack of adaptation are no longer regarded as laziness, but as a betrayal of the national community. Already Hitler and Stalin wanted to catch up with the functioning of the industry of the most advanced countries, which was not inhibited by any residuals, at high pressure. National Socialism and Communism sought to eradicate the last vestiges of non-rigid ways of being, and the excessive nationalism of the backward countries today springs from the same drive for frenzied industrialization, the production of consumer goods for the people and luxury articles of prestige, armaments, and the all-encompassing police and propaganda apparatus for domination. The inertia, the weakness of the individuals is eradicated. Each must accomplish the violent disciplining on himself, or if he could not, perish. In the face of the unimagined wealth of the world powers, the indigenous masses feel their poverty as a shame, and the new national pride is the transformed rage over the misery, and at the same time the shackle that chains them to their own autochthonous masters. The elites and clever leaders of the Afro-Asian peoples draw strength from the irrepressible will of their own economic miracle, and the masses march along in enthusiasm. What went before is hated, abstractly denied, barbarically killed. At most, a glorious history, long since vanished, serves as a propagandistic symbol of national national renewal. Such history, long since vanished, such processes, in which the real past is liquidated instead of being carried over, have always been connected with the extermination of whole groups of people, and the curse of organized terror has always played into the transition to the new form of society that owed its existence to it. In thought, unmediated negation means oblivion and blindness. In reality, it means murder. End quote. Horkheimer. And even before Islamism celebrated Islamism's barbaric triumphs on a broader basis, Horkheimer had already recognized Islam as an adequate superstructure of national revolutionary ambitions in the early 1960s. Quote, Christianity proclaims the value of the individual soul. Through Christianity's doctrine of eternity, Christianity has given the value of the individual soul infinite importance. The dogmas that the present day professes make the nation absolute, and if necessary, the conquest of the world, whether in peace or in war. In Africa, Islam is celebrating success. It is easier to adapt to the new attitude than the gospel of loving one's enemies. The prophet's concept of God has never been contradicted by war campaigns, violent conversion, and the extermination of enemies. The conquest of the territories now called Pakistan surpasses in atrocity most episodes in history. Islam has a special affinity for national power, end quote. Horkheimer. New section. Dialectics of Counter-Enlightenment. It speaks for the incorruptible sharpness of Adorno and of Horkheimer, the latter being even more articulate in this respect, that they did not submit reverently to the anti-colonial truisms of the, quote, national dignity, the, quote, cultural identity of autochthonous peoples, as almost all metropolitan intellectuals did, but recognized the talk of foreign cultures, which one must respect per se, as a bare euphemism for underdevelopment, misery, and stupidity, and thus as a title of empowerment and legitimization for domination. For if the colonial powers were and are to be accused of one thing with certainty, it is that they did not fulfill the quote civilizing mission they propagated, but left behind nothing worth mentioning apart from plundered and devastated territories. To turn these facts upside down, so to speak, to take the legitimization of colonization at face value, and pass the legitimization of colonization as the cause itself, by accusing the colonial powers of having imposed a foreign, quote, Western culture on the natives, i.e., not having robbed them, but of having brought them something, even too much. It is the cliques and gangs from which the prospective state leaders. Where am I? Fuck. Where am I? To turn these facts upside down, so to speak, to take the legitimization of colonization at face value and pass the legitimization of colonization off as the cause itself, by accusing the colonial powers of having imposed a foreign, quote, Western culture on the natives, i.e., not having robbed them, but of having brought them something, even too much. It is the cliques and gangs from which the prospective state leaders of the, quote, Third World were recruited who had the greatest interest in this reversal of colonial practice. Declaring war on, quote, Western civilization in the name of an independent culture meant nothing other than a general authorization for a rule that constituted the mobilized masses as a military community defined by the cleansing of society from enemies of the people, spies, imperialist stooges, etc. One only has to read Frantz Fanon's most quoted treatise, The Wretched of the Earth, in which Fanon declares individualism and cosmopolitanism to be the greatest obstacles on the way to a truly independent culture of the, quote, indigenous population, end quote. It is the fate of every movement that is directed against the Enlightenment, the West, or civilization, that movement's actions do not lead back to any original form of life, neither to Germanicism nor to African tribalism, that have been irrevocably destroyed by capitalization, but that they lead with natural necessity to emancipating modern domination, which is not European or Western, but capitalist, from those restrictions and mediations which distinguish it, however unstable and precarious, from pre-capitalist domination. In this, the dialectic of enlightenment, the book, is directly and at the same time always a dialectic of counter-enlightenment. Well, he has in italics, but I think he's using it. I don't think he needed to. In this, the dialectic of enlightenment is directly and at the same time always a dialectic of counter-enlightenment. The declared regression politically promotes, intentionally or unintentionally, the natural progress of capital, which is one toward the abyss. Quote, cultural identity, the superstructure of national revolutionary autarky, is nothing other than the cover address of despotism. Thus, the anti-colonial cliques have not freed the impoverished masses in their countries, but rather the rule from the rule's shackles, and with reference to the, quote, humiliation, end quote, they have suffered, freed themselves from considering world opinion. They also, and above all, freed the colonial powers from the responsibility of making up for the misery they had caused, for example, by annexing the colonial territories to the mother country, with the effect that the former colonized people would become citizens, and the colonies would become provinces or federal states that could quite naturally benefit from subsidies, compensation payments, and infrastructure measures, as is customary in all nations, to create equal living conditions. The transformation of colonies into sovereign nation states, on the other hand, meant nothing more than the rejection of unprofitable and costly property. To me, meant nothing more than the rejection of unprofitable and costly property. The exclusion and democratization of the misery that the colonized were now left to administer themselves. Decolonization thus already realized on a large scale what is taking place today is misery self-administration inside the countries. For example, in Porto Alegre. Because wealth does not consist of the possession of land and natural resources, but of capital, because national liberation is a national one was doomed to failure, it could only survive badly and fairly as a subsidy enterprise that was either kept alive by donations, loans, and development aid from Western countries, or was able to stay afloat through trade under preferential conditions offered by the Second World Market of CMEA, Council of Mutual Economic Assistance, when it still existed. Sorry, I was looking up the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, which is the same thing as Comic-Con. The Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, often abbreviated as Comic-Con, was an economic organization from 1949 to 1991 under the leadership of the Soviet Union that comprised the countries of the Eastern Bloc along with a number of socialist states elsewhere in the world. The descriptive term is often applied to all multilateral activities involving members of the organization, rather than being restricted to the direct functions of Comic-Con and its organs. This usage was sometimes extended as well to bilateral relations among members, because in the system of communist international economic relations, multilateral accords, typically of a general nature, tended to be implemented through a set of more detailed bilateral agreements. Comic-Con was in the Eastern Bloc's Comic-Con was the Eastern Bloc's response to the formation in Western Europe of the Marshall Plan and the OEC, which later became the OECD. Okay, so back to the text. To see this as a, quote, betrayal of the ideal of, quote, true national liberation, end quote, as the left in particular still does when it jabbers in shrill moralistic tone about the right of peoples to have control over their own resources, is no longer simply a lack of concepts and ignorance, but simply means that one wishes for as many dead bodies as possible, which one can then mourn virtuously as victims of imperialism. From a logical point of view, catching up on a national development is an absurdity, because national independence can only be realized as its own opposite, as a form of mutual dependence in the medium of the world market. Making the abstraction of the nation a reality and putting national autarky into practice can mean nothing other than the mass murder as in Cambodia under Pol Pot, which Vietnam thankfully put an end to. Thus, as early as the 1950s, there would have been every reason not only to mistrust the emerging self-confidence of the, quote, third world, which was charged with revolutionary pathos and childlike belief in redemption by its leaders, and the metropolitan intellectuals who courted them, when it was attested that, quote, the third world and the third world's cultures could serve as an example to the rotten and decayed Western world and enable it to recover inwardly, but also to denounce it as a continuation of the delusions of victimization and paranoia, and as a continuation of, quote, national socialism, end quote. The overturning of capitalist socialization into barbarism, as Adorno and Horkheimer did. For the self-consciousness formulated by the prospective state leaders of the quote third world countries, the cliques and gangs of the national revolutionary movements consisted and consists de facto in a self-disempowerment, in the reclamation of the status as mere victims, which by virtue of being a victim is authorized from the outset to do anything, whose deeds are historically justified from the outset, and which is therefore entitled to refuse not only any interference, but also any criticism, eo ipso, as either, quote, ethnocentric or, quote, Eurocentric arrogance, or as, quote, racism. Thus, already at the beginning of decolonization, unspoken, but with, as we see today, all the more lasting effect, is a form of thinking that Ike Geisel once characterized in a different context with the catchphrase, quote, longing for victimhood and Jew envy, end quote. Ike Geisel. Um, hmm. German Wikipedia says Ike Geisel lived from 1945 to 1997. Ike Geisel was a German journalist and essayist. Ike Geisel became known in Germany and Israel as one of the first people to research everyday Jewish life in German cities, especially Berlin before 1933 in the 70s and 80s. Ike Geisel also critically examined Jewish history and Zionism, particularly the work of the philosopher and political scientist Hannah Arendt, but above all the way German society dealt with these issues. Ike Geisel was a sharp critic both of his contemporaries in the so-called 1968 movement and of the bourgeois mainstream of the Kohl era since 1982. It says there's a section here that says controversial essays and cultural historical works and translations. Ike Geisel's essays and polemics have sometimes sparked significant controversy. Ike Geisel's review of John Sachs' book An Eye for an Eye, Victims of the Holocaust as Perpetrators, in the Frankfurter Rundschau, the Taz newspaper had rejected the article, became particularly well known as, quote, anti-Semitic raw food, end quote. Piper Verlag withdrew the German translation in the spring of 1995 due to the resulting controversy. In Israel, he published in Haaretz, among other publications, because of his critical comments about Ben Gurion. An interview with the Israeli historian Tom Segev about the founding generation of the State of Israel was highly controversial. Ike Geisel also translated Hannah Arendt and made her essays. This is a bad translation. Let me try this again. Ike Geisel also translated Hannah Arendt and made her essays on Zionism, Palestine, and Germany accessible to the German public. Together with Henrik M. Broder, Ike Geisel drew attention to a previously neglected chapter of cultural policy during the Nazi era through publications and a documentary film about the Jewish Cultural League. A book project about Jewish revenge and failed plots to attack SS prisoners of war and Nazi officials by a Jewish resistance group named after Herbert Baum in the immediate post-war period remained unfinished. Geisel died at the age of 52 as the result of a stroke and was buried in Stuben-Rauschstrasse Municipal Cemetery in Berlin-Friedenau. So where am I? Back to the text. Thus already at the beginning of decolonization, unspoken, but with, as we see today, all the more lasting effect in a form of thinking that Ike Geisel once characterized in a different context with the catchphrases, quote, longing for victimhood and Jew envy, end quote. In order to make claims, the, quote, oppressed peoples, end quote, present themselves as victims persecuted for no reason, but the Jews and Auschwitz stand in the way. If the categories of perpetrator and victim, which by the way are better avoided anyway because of their oily, rancid pathos, reminiscent of the ceremonial lectures of professional, quote, overcomers of history, end quote, apply at all to a phenomenon, then they do to modern anti-Semitism culminating in Nazi-fascist mass murder, which in fact carries out an existential declaration of the enemy, which proceeds without any consideration of age, sex, attitude, ability to work, in short, all social characteristics, and which in fact leaves all those affected by it no chance, and reduces them first mentally and then practically to mere victims, to material to be destroyed. This fundamentally distinguishes anti-Semitism from colonial racism, which as a socially necessary semblance of colonial practice arises from the fact that the value determination of colonial labor power is dissolved into nature. The historical moral reproduction of labor power is reduced to a physiological reproduction, the socially necessary to the naturally necessary labor, people to animal nature, to animal existence. They become, quote, inferior in the literal sense of the word because they are treated disgustingly, while on the surface it appears, and is made to appear, as if the lousy treatment corresponds to a, quote, natural inferiority, an objective inversion of all those are interested in maintaining, who are driven by the fear of descending into social death, and who therefore construct their suitability for exploitation as a natural characteristic. I am white, well-trained, a woman, and ascendant Aries. Thus, racism, for all the crimes and atrocities racism is covered up, is an ideology of competition of all capitalized subjects against everyone, which is naturalized into a cutthroat competition, a struggle for existence. It therefore marks a declaration of the enemy that wants to hold the other down and eat away at them, but still sees in them, however mistakenly and delusionally, the labor power, and thus the equal. Thus racism occurs within the framework of comparison and competition, while anti-Semitism turns against the comparison of individuals as capital subjects, which it creates through exchange, abstractifies it into a conspiracy, and projects it onto empirical persons whom it wants to destroy without regard to their particularities. Anti-Semitism is the barbaric uprising of all the resentful and victim-hungry, no matter how much they want to use whatever, quote, racist pretexts to get at each other. New section. From the body of the people. Leveling out this difference is the quintessence of the anti-colonial and anti-racist declarations. For example, in an influential paper titled Discourse on Colonialism, published in France in 1955 and reprinted in German translation in 1966, the aforementioned Aimé Césaire manages to explain the rational thought he developed, that colonization is a process which not only oppresses the colonized, but also, quote, decivilizes and, quote, brutalizes the colonizer, awakening in him, quote, moral relativism, end quote, in the following affirmative way and placing it in the service of an even more monstrous relativism. Quote, and then one fine day the bourgeoisie is awakened to a... I don't know if I said quote. Quote, and then one fine day the bourgeoisie is awakened by a terrific boomerang effect. The Gestapos are busy, the prisons fill up, the torturers standing round the racks invent refined disgust, ... People are surprised, they become indignant. They say, quote, how strange, but never mind, it's Nazism, it will pass, end quote. And they wait, and they hope, and they hide the truth from themselves. that it is barbarism, the supreme barbarism, the crowning barbarism that sums up all the daily barbarisms. Dot dot dot. That they tolerated that Nazism before it was inflicted on them, that they absolved that Nazism, shut their eyes to it, legitimized it, because until then it had been applied to only to non-European peoples. Dot dot dot. Yes, it would be worthwhile. Dot dot dot. To reveal the very distinguished, very humanistic, very Christian bourgeois of the 20th century, that without his being aware of it, he has a Hitler inside him. Dot dot dot. And that at bottom, what he cannot forgive Hitler for is not the crime itself, the crime against man. It is not the humiliation of man as such, it is the crime against the white man, the humiliation of the white man, and the fact that he applied to Europe colonialist procedures which until then had been reserved exclusively for the Arabs of Algeria, the quote coolies of India, and the quote niggers of Africa, end quote. Amy Césaire. Just want to look up this book real quick. Discourse on Colonialism. Discourse on Colonialism is an essay by Amy Césaire, a poet and politician from Martinique who helped found the Negritude movement in Francophone literature. Césaire first published the essay in 1950 in Paris with editions Reclame, a small publisher associated with the French Communist Party. 5 years later, he then edited and republished it with the anti-colonial publisher Présence Africaine. The 1955 edition is the one with the widest circulation today and serves as a foundational text of post-colonial literature that discusses what Césaire described as the appalling affair of the European civilizing mission. Rather than elevating the non-Western world, the decolonizers decivilize themselves. Bracket, failed verification, end bracket. Here we go, back to the text. One has to really let this perfidious argumentation settle. On the one hand, anti-Semitism and the mass murder of Jews are simply subsumed under racism, implying that it was basically nothing special, a quote application of colonial practices to Europe, end quote, and thus basically a negligible butchery among whites. On the other hand, in the same breath, the specificity of anti-Semitic mass murder is explicitly conceded, in that, conversely, colonialism itself is defined as a variety of Nazism, because the Jews are to be challenged on their status as victims, and the moral surplus value of being able to present themselves as victims of fascism is to be pocketed. The argument exploits the ambiguity that lies in the category of the particular, even before all particular content. On the one hand, anti-Semitic Nazi fascism is supposed to be the only climax of racist violence. On the other hand, it is supposed to be the absolute climax in such a way that it embodies the very essence of this racist violence. This is the basic quid pro quo of anti-racism. From a distance, this schizophrenic argumentation is already reminiscent of the insane pamphlets that appear day after day in the Arab media, where one manages to declare Auschwitz an invention of the Zionists on the one hand, and to lament that the Palestinians are the victims of the new Holocaust on the other hand. Footnote, 20 years ago, Rosa Amelia Plumele Uribe, I don't know if I'm saying their name right, a French author trained by text of Aimé Césaire, Frantz Fanon, and Malcolm X, came forward with a book, 2004, which explicitly draws all the evil consequences that are only implied in Césaire. The extermination of the European Jews is for them, quote, only the racist colonial politics backfiring on Europe, and the fact that the Jews were considered, quote, special victims after 1945 is only due to the fact that they are, quote, white. Conversely, however, all the predicates of the extermination of the Jews are claimed for colonial practices. Genocide, extermination, barbarism, and, quote, racism is declared an essential characteristic of, quote, whites and of the West as a whole. No wonder that her book ends in a savage tirade against Israel as a colonial and her logic Nazi apartheid state. Rosa Emilia Plumele Uribe's work gathers in its vulgarity all the figures of thought that have become reputable today under the slogans, quote, post-colonialism, or even more insanely, quote, critical whiteness, end quote, are currently cultivated by a charlatan like Achille Mbembe. According to a website titled African Books Collective, Amelia Rose Plumel Uribe, I'm not sure how to pronounce the name. It's Plumele Uribe. How I'm going to say it. France-based lawyer and essayist Rosa Emilia Plumele Uribe was born on the 24th of December 1951 in Montalbano, Colombia. Towards the end of the 1970s in Bogota, the capital of Colombia, Rosa Emilia Plumea, it's actually probably Plumea Uribe. I don't fucking know what I'm saying, so sorry. Rosa Emilia Plumea Uribe was part of the, quote, black culture group, where she became aware of the position of blacks in the history of humankind. From then on, Rosa Emilia Plumea Uribe has focused her work on denouncing crimes and injustices perpetrated under the banner of white domination and oppression and the racial discrimination of other groups, including the slave trade, slavery, massacres of indigenous people by settler populations, colonialism, Nazism, and apartheid. Through her work over the years, she continues to build a different north-south relationship. Back to the text. End footnote. How influential Césaire's argumentation is, how exemplary Césaire puts the Ungeist of racism and decolonization in a nutshell, may be illustrated by the appearance of the left-wing lawyer and Maoist Jacques Vergès, who defended the Gestapo officer Klaus Barbie at the end of the 1980s and never tired of stressing in his pleas that the trial was hypocritical and, quote, Eurocentric, because the discussion of the Nazi atrocities only distracted from European colonial crimes, which in turn the Germans', quote, obsession with guilt, end quote, was responsible. Be that as it may, the anti-racism that on the one hand makes Auschwitz disappear in racism, and on the other hand uses Auschwitz to declare racism the crime against humanity par excellence, perpetuates the German victim mythology, but in a form that appears to be an adequate lesson from Nazi fascism, and is beyond all doubt. After all, everyone is against racism. In it, quote, racism becomes a cipher for injustice and inequality par excellence, a cipher that is flexible enough to include both structuralist notions of racism as a, quote, system, and personalist notions of racism as a characterological defect or pure malice. In this constitutive oscillation, racism becomes synonymous with, quote, imperialism, and thus with the notion of domination as privilege legitimized by the discrimination and exclusion of others, of domination as usurpation and as a foreign body in the organic body of the, quote, people, as can be demonstrated by countless imperialist pamphlets and UN resolutions. Through such anticipatory self-exculpation, which blames all evil on, quote, racism/imperialism, end quote, the anti-racist ideology already prepares an enemy in advance, whom it will hold responsible for the failure of national revolutionary ambitions. It is then only a small step before the key word, quote, Jew, or, quote, Jewish world supremacy, end quote, is mentioned. And indeed, it is no wonder that the more desperate the situation of the national socialisms of the, quote, Third World became, the more the discrete anti-Semitism, which had been the basis of the national awakening since the 1940s, was openly admitted, as anti-Zionism, which now uses the distinction already made by the Nazis between, quote, organic and, quote, illegitimate states, which is analogous to that between, quote, productive and, quote, rapacious capital against Israel. As an example of this is the UN resolution of 1975, which denounced Nazism as a form of racism, a resolution that Henrik Broder quite rightly compared to the Nuremberg laws as early as the 1980s in terms of its scope and consequences. Wikipedia says Henrik M. Broder, born 1946, is a Polish-born German journalist, author, and television personality. He was born into a Jewish family in Katowice, Poland. Henrik Broder is especially interested in Vergangenheitsbewältigung, Islam, Israel, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Henrik Broder sees a close relationship between German criticism of Israel's policies and anti-Semitism. And that word that I just said that it was in German, Vergangenheitsbewältigung, translates as work of coping with the past. Back to the text. In fact, this can also be read in Henrik Broder's book and can easily be confirmed since the publication of the book. Almost no UN conferences passed at which, no matter the topic discussed, whether the situation of women, malnutrition, or religion, Israel and Zionism have been judged, although, or presumably precisely because the conferences generated only inconsequential gibberish. Discussing clitoral circumcision in Africa, for example, and blaming Judaism and Zionism for such practices is basically a farce that would be terribly funny if this complete lunacy were not meant seriously, if it were not applauded, and if it were not institutionally covered and sanctioned by the UN. The Durban Anti-Racism Conference is thus only the preliminary culminator of a long development. Wikipedia says the World Conference Against Racism 2001, also known as Durban 1, was held at the Durban International Convention Center in Durban, South Africa, under UN auspices from the 31st of August to the 8th of September 2001. The conference covered several controversial issues, including redress for transatlantic slavery and the secondary class citizenry issue in Palestine, Israel. One second. The language of the final declaration and program of action produced by the conference was strongly disputed in these areas, both in the preparatory meetings in the months that preceded the conference and during the conference itself. Two delegations, the United States and Israel, withdrew from the conference over objections to a draft document equating Zionism with racism. The final declaration and program of action did not contain the text that the U.S. and Israel had objected to. That text having been voted out by delegates in the days after the U.S. and Israel withdrew. In parallel to the conference, a separate held NGO forum also produced a declaration and program of its own that was not an official conference document, which contained language relating to Israel that the WCAR had voted to exclude from its declaration, and which was criticized by then United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights Mary Robinson and many others. The NGO forum ended in discord. Mary Robinson lost the support of the United States in her office of High Commissioner, and many of the potential political after effects of the conference were annulled by the 11th of September 2001 attacks. The attacks took place just 3 days after the conference ended, entirely eclipsing it in the news and significantly affecting international relations and politics. The conference was followed by the 2009 Durban II conference in Geneva, which was boycotted by 10 Western countries. A commemorative Durban III conference in September 2011 in New York has also drawn significant criticism and was boycotted by 14 Western countries. Back to the text. The Durban Anti-Racism Conference is thus only the preliminary culmination of a long development. Durban then found a worthy continuation in the summer of 2002 at the World Summit on Sustainable Development. There it was South African President Mbeki who finally extended the interpretive sovereignty of the concept of racism to the question of the production and distribution of wealth. The deepening gap between the poor and the rich, he decreed, was nothing other than, quote, social apartheid, end quote, i.e. racial segregation in the area of wealth. No one before Mbeki has ever stated more clearly that spontaneous anti-capitalism, as it is currently booming, aims at nothing other than a, quote, final solution to the capitalist question by branding exploitation and pauperization as an emanation of evil intentions, as racial discrimination by capitalists who have been declared to be the counter-race, and in doing so promotes the gathering of the wretched into a pack, into a persecuted collective, and thus into a race itself. Thus it is anti-racism that, the more it elevates itself into an absolute pattern of interpretation of social processes of all kinds, increasingly racializes society. One second. Okay. New section. Victim collective is, quote, me incorporated, end quote. In this suitability as a universal explanatory key for actual or perceived injustice of all kinds, anti-Semitic connotations of anti-racism are not only popular in the international context in which Germany is preparing to promote the alliance of, quote, proletarian nations against Israel, but also in the metropolises themselves. Here, too, this ideological upswing is due to no other circumstance than the economic downturn, i.e. the crisis of capital. Since the definitive end of the post-war economy and the collapse of, quote, actually existing socialism, end quote, more and more workers have been declared, virtually or actually, surplus existences. The more the competition of individuals, in the face of shrinking margins of distribution, turns into a cutthroat competition, the more obvious it becomes that the mental and physical self-equipping of individuals to become equal subjects for utilization falls flat, because this equipping is no longer followed by realization due to lack of demand. The more the fear of social death is articulated as anger at the comparative principle, and the more the tenacious feeling spreads that one is being systematically defrauded of work and wages, namely by corrupt, filthy powers, the more panicky and brutal the individuals as subjects insist, qua supposed natural characteristics, the more they want to be privileged men, women, lesbians, overweight, wrinkle-faced, ring-eyed people, the more vehemently they openly or secretly demand a counter-sovereign who co-opts them as a swinging mass and repays their loyalty by letting them temporarily survive. And the clue here is that they claim preferential treatment not by invoking any strength or positive quality that distinguishes them, but by invoking precisely their weakness, namely by presenting themselves as victims of persecution and discrimination. In other words, and appropriately paradoxically, the only strength they display is their supposed weakness, but it's precisely this self-disempowerment that they represent offensively and self-confidently. The post-bourgeois social character inverts the Cartesian proof of existence. I think, therefore I am, end quote, which enthroned the individual as the sovereign ruler of the external world, into a, quote, I suffer, therefore I am, end quote, a formula that only expresses the powerlessness of individuals in the face of reified social conditions, by immediately transfiguring individuals at the same time as narcissistically imagined omnipotence. The more the general exchangeability of individuals is actualized as being actual surplus, the more the individual withdraws into itself and understands itself as an autarkic, unmistakable structure, the more fiercely the outside world is rejected and all others are identified as intruders. The individual becomes the smallest existing minority and understands itself according to the pattern of persecuted peoples. I am a victim, unjustly discriminated against and persecuted, and because I have been so badly treated, I am entitled to strike back. For this, no one is allowed to criticize me, because I am different in principle, a threatening culture worthy of protection, and which no one else demands. This or something similar is what the infantile and projective social character is thinking. This appeal to weakness is nothing other than an empowerment title for a domination that camouflages itself with weakness, and in this way presents itself as incontestable and even unresponsive. It appears as the advocate of the weak, the discriminated, and the neglected, and uses its means of power in a completely unscrupulous manner, i.e. with a boundlessly good conscience, a domination for which Horkheimer coined the term of the, quote, rackets. On the other hand, every single subject that understands itself in this inverted and inhibited way and acts according to it represents a racket in miniature form, then its own person, and on its own initiative, brings such a form of power that means a generalized tribalism on the way. A democratization and diffusion of mass delusion is taking place here, which continues the victim movements of the recent past, as they had arisen not only in Germany since the 1970s as a manifestation of the crisis, and as whose most sinister the women's, the peace, and the ecology movements may be considered in equal measure, and dissolves them as a collective phenomenon. That the individual who sees itself as a threatened people in miniature today has countless possibilities for rationalizing its projectivity at its disposal is thanks to the organic intellectuals of those movements, intellectuals such as Pierre Bourdieu, who, inspired by the anti-colonial awakening experience, strove throughout his life to apply the categories of ethnology to the developed countries as a whole. And in doing so, proved that suppressed cultures existed not only on a global scale, but also within states, which were equivalent to each other as, quote, social codes, as, quote, cultural capital, which is why it is allegedly nothing more than elitist arrogance, an imperialism of the spirit, so to speak, to measure all culture against bourgeois high culture, as Adorno did. In this context, one must continue to think above all the deconstructivist theories of the most diverse provenance, which with a bureaucratic gesture define each individual only as an intersection of the various forms of oppression and discrimination to which they are exposed, and which ultimately culminate in the delusional idea that each and every one is oppressed in such a unique way that everyone can only speak for himself, and that any criticism and judgment from the outside is seen as an illegitimate interference, as unsolicited meddling, as racist presumption that only reveals the critic's narrow-minded Eurocentric/male/white or otherwise perhorist, quote, locus of speech, end quote. The modern delusion of victimhood, fed by infantilism and narcissism, answers to the name of, quote, political correctness. The more the individual encapsulates itself in the prison of its supposed, quote, identity, and thus indeed begins to resemble a race in miniature, the more the concept of race becomes frowned upon. Not a real paradox, for it is the concept of race that is the only remaining reminder of the shamefulness of this action. That is what Turka quite rightly skewered as an inflation of the concept of racism years ago already. In this, racism proves to be a superficial and transient manifestation of a social economic state of affairs. Racism, understood as the doctrine of the hereditary superiority of certain collectives over other collectives, disappears as the principle on which it is based becomes more flexible and generalized. The reclamation of natural characteristics, pursued by all subjects individually in competition with one another, which is supposed to disposition everyone to successful exploitation. New section. Marketing of affliction. The less the market mediates the exchange of labor and capital, the more it transforms into a political, quote, marketing of affliction, in which the superfluous compete with their paranoid projections for the victim bonus, and they do so on their own terms. In the process, the plurality of projections and rationalizations only conceals the fact that they are all essentially driven by the same thing, by the deep-seated resentment against the comparative principle, which they finally find illusionally incarnated in the Jews and the plutocrats, in Israel and the USA, and by the longing for the collective disinhibition in the night of the long knives, where they can take infinite revenge for their bleak and botched lives, which they make out to be a chain of gratuitous and deliberately inflicted humiliations, instead of attributing it to their own complicity in the wrongly configured world. Against this background, it is no wonder that the majority of the European population does not support the actually threatened Jewish state, but identifies with the Jew-murdering Palestinians, whom they see as their pioneering fighters. It is precisely this plurality, however, that gives the anonymous generality of the victim and persecution mongers their characteristic imprint and their disgusting activities their respectability. Together they constitute a multicultural mob that represents a politically correct anti-Semitism for the protection of minorities, to which no one has anything to object. In Germany, politicians have sanctified the integration of immigrants into living in Germany as, quote, our fellow foreign citizens, end quote, even if they may be the worst of anti-Semitic Islamists. This is the perspective which we will probably have to grapple with in the future. That's the end of the piece. Thanks for listening.